The desert was almost silent, except for the whisper of wind rolling over the sand like a sigh from an ancient god. The last colors of the evening painted the mountains in fading gold, and the sky turned the color of smoke. Somewhere beyond the thorn trees and dry creek beds, a man lay still, his body blended with the earth, his heart beating so softly it seemed in rhythm with the wind. Through the glass of his scope, he saw the shimmer of headlights crawling along a dirt road. 3 vehicles, moving in convoy. He exhaled slowly, barely breathing. They called him El Tirator, the sniper. But no one knew his real name. To the men who whispered his story, he was a ghost, a myth born in the Sinaloa dust. They said he could hit a coin from half a kilometer away, that he once shot a man through the eye in a storm without missing a heartbeat. Others claimed he never missed because he never wanted to. The truth, like the desert, was empty and endless, full of mirages. The convoy slowed. The leader's truck stopped near a ridge, where the wind shifted. The man in the sand adjusted his aim, not because he needed to, but because it was part of the ritual. The feel of the metal beneath his fingers was calm, familiar, almost comforting. He was not thinking of killing. He was thinking of distance, of silence, of the strange peace that always came before the shot. In the stillness of that moment, the desert felt alive, listening. A coyote howled somewhere far off. A radio crackled. Then, without sound or warning, the rifle spoke. A single flash, a single echo rolling across the hills. One man fell. The others froze, searching the darkness. But the shooter had already vanished into it, moving like a shadow swallowed by another shadow. The rifle disappeared beneath a blanket. The sand covered his footprints. Within minutes, there was no trace that he had ever been there. In the villages below, men told the story differently each time. Some said he was sent by the cartel's king himself, El Chapo, the invisible hand guiding Sinaloa's empire. Others believed he worked for no one, a lone marksman protecting balance, punishing betrayal. What no one understood was that the man behind the rifle never thought of himself as either hero or villain. He was simply a tool, a fragment of order in a land of chaos. He lived by one rule: see everything, say nothing. At night, he stayed far from the cities. He slept beneath the stars, listening to the hum of insects and the low breath of the earth cooling after heat. The rifle always rested beside him, not as a weapon, but as a companion, cold, loyal, and silent. In dreams, he sometimes saw faces. Men he had watched through the scope. Eyes widening in that last instant before the wind took their breath. He woke each time with the same feeling, not guilt, not pride, but an ache that never left his chest. The legend of the Sinaloa Sniper began that way, with one clean shot and a name that wasn't a name. Cartel lieutenants whispered of a man who appeared only when the bosses were threatened, who seemed to know where danger moved before it showed itself. He guarded convoys from ambushes, watched the ranches from distant hills, and vanished before dawn. He asked for no money beyond his ration of silence. For years, no photograph of him existed. Those who had seen his face never spoke again, some from loyalty, some from fear. And yet, there was something almost sacred in the way he was remembered. In the world of blood and greed, he was different. He didn't kill for power. He killed because he believed he had to. The bosses called him Protector. The soldiers called him Ghost. The villagers, who saw his silhouette against the moon, called him the man who guards the wind. If you listen to the desert long enough, they say, you can still hear the faint click of a rifle's bolt echoing through the stones at night. Some claim he never left, that he watches over the valleys still, eyes pressed to an invisible scope, guarding something no one else can see. But no one truly knew him then, not the kingpins he protected, not the enemies he destroyed, not the stories written in the dust. He was both everywhere and nowhere, a figure made of patience, silence, and purpose. His legend began where the light ended, in that vast, endless stillness between day and night. And somewhere out there, in the hush of the desert wind, the Sinaloa Sniper waited, calm, unseen, and ready for the next breath of danger to stir the sand once more. The sun rose slow and heavy over the hills of Sinaloa, warming the cracked earth and the tin roofs of forgotten homes. In a small village surrounded by fields of corn and dust, a boy woke to the sound of roosters and the scent of smoke from his mother's stove. The air was thick with the smell of the desert, dry, sun-baked, and endless. He rubbed his eyes, slipped on worn sandals, and stepped into a world where childhood ended too soon. He had no famous name then. No one called him El Tirator. He was just a quiet boy with black hair that curled in the heat and eyes too sharp for his age. His mother said he was born during a thunderstorm, lightning cracking over the hills like the voice of something ancient. Maybe that was why, even as a child, he never feared the sound of storms, or the sound of gunfire. Life in the village was simple, but not easy. The men rose early to tend to the fields or find day work. The women prayed, cooked, and hoped their sons would not disappear into the cartels like so many before them. The boy's father was a farmer, his hands rough as stone, his back bent from years of coaxing life out of dead soil. When the rains failed, the family ate less. When the harvest came, they thanked God and waited for the next drought. There were no dreams beyond survival, no future beyond the horizon. Yet the boy saw the world differently. He would lie on the dry earth for hours, watching the hawks circle high above the canyons. He studied their patience, how they waited for the smallest movement before striking. When he was old enough, his father gave him a slingshot, a child's toy to keep him busy. He spent days practicing with it, learning to hit cans, bottles, even lizards darting across the stones. The first time he hit his mark perfectly, something inside him stirred, not pride, but quiet understanding. Precision was peace. He began to help his father hunt rabbits in the early mornings, when mist still clung to the hills. His father taught him to move silently, to read the wind, to wait until the world stopped moving before he pulled the trigger. The desert has ears, his father said. It hears every mistake. The boy listened. He learned to breathe with the earth, to see the smallest details, a broken twig, a shadow shifting on a rock, a bird startled from silence. School was a formality. The teacher came twice a week when she could, bringing books worn thin from years of hands. The boy read slowly but remembered everything, maps of faraway places, stories of wars and soldiers who could shoot from a mile away. He didn't know such men existed outside the pages, but something about them stayed with him. In those quiet hours, when he sat alone under the mesquite tree, he imagined himself not as a killer, but as someone who saw what others couldn't, the smallest truth hidden in the farthest distance. But the village was not untouched by the world beyond. Trucks would pass through sometimes, men with guns, men who smelled of cologne and power, throwing money to children like they were feeding pigeons. Everyone pretended not to see them. The boy's mother would pull him inside, whispering prayers under her breath. He didn't understand why she trembled. To him, those men looked like kings, confident, unafraid, and untouchable. He watched the dust rise behind their tires, wondering where they went when the road disappeared into the mountains. The older he grew, the more he noticed things others ignored. He saw how fear moved through his village like wind, invisible but everywhere. At night, the adults whispered about disappearances, about men taken for debts, about others who joined the business and came back in new trucks with dark eyes and nervous hands. The boy listened quietly, pretending to sleep. He began to understand that silence could keep you alive longer than courage ever would. When he turned 13, his father fell ill. Work stopped. Food grew scarce. The boy began helping neighbors, carrying water, fixing fences, doing anything that brought a few pesos. But the hunger in his home never left. One evening, while returning from the fields, he found a small rifle leaning against a fence post, old, rusted, forgotten. No one claimed it. He took it home, cleaned it, and hid it beneath his bed. For weeks, he only held it at night, feeling its weight, the cool metal against his hands. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt like truth, heavy, real, and full of quiet possibility. His mother saw it once and begged him to throw it away. "Guns bring death," she said. He promised her he would, but he never did. Instead, he carried it deep into the fields where no one went, learning to aim at cans, bottles, and shadows. The rifle kicked hard, bruising his shoulder, but each time he fired, the sound echoed against the mountains like a heartbeat. He learned to love the stillness before the shot, the moment when everything seemed to stop breathing. By the time he was 15, his accuracy was no longer just a rumor among the children. Grown men began to notice. Farmers would ask him to protect their crops from coyotes or to bring down birds that raided the fields. He never missed. He never bragged. He simply nodded and walked away, carrying the rifle as if it were part of him. In the evenings, he would sit on the roof of his house, watching the sunset stretch over the land. He could see the road winding into the horizon, the same road that led to Culiacan, to the world of men with gold watches and fast cars. He wondered what waited there. A better life, perhaps. Or just another kind of hunger. He didn't know it yet, but the road he watched every night would soon lead him away from everything he loved. It would take him into the deserts and mountains, into the empire of kings and killers. The boy who once hunted rabbits to feed his family would one day protect the most powerful men in Mexico. But for now, he was just a quiet soul with a rifle and a steady eye, standing at the edge of the world, unaware that his aim, and his silence, would become legend. The boy's hands trembled the first time he held a real rifle, not the worn, rusted one he'd found years ago, but a clean, oiled weapon made for war. It was heavier, smoother, almost beautiful in its craftsmanship. The man who handed it to him said nothing, only nodded once and walked away. The boy understood. Words were not needed in this part of the world. A rifle was a language of its own. It began quietly, as most things do. A cousin returned from military service with stories of discipline, survival, and killing without hate. He brought with him a small bolt-action rifle, nothing fancy, just a relic from years gone by. The cousin was proud of it but careless. The boy begged to hold it, to feel its weight, to know how it worked. When he finally did, something in him shifted, like a puzzle piece falling into place. He studied every detail, the smooth slide of the bolt, the cold barrel, the faint scent of oil and metal. At first, he used it only for hunting. He would walk out before dawn, before even the roosters stirred, and lie flat among the mesquite bushes. The world was soft then, the sky pale, the air cool, the only sounds the faint hum of insects. He learned to wait for the right moment, to listen for the smallest breath of the wind. And when the rabbit appeared, hopping across the stones, he did not rush. He inhaled deeply, exhaled halfway, and squeezed the trigger as if whispering a secret. The shot cracked through the silence, and the rabbit fell instantly. He sat there for a long time afterward, watching the dust settle, feeling the weight of what he had done. It wasn't pride or sadness, just quiet understanding. Word spread quickly. In small towns like his, nothing stayed secret for long. Old men at the cantina would nod when he passed. "The boy shoots like the wind," they'd say. Farmers began asking him to handle wild dogs or to protect their livestock from thieves. Each time, he accepted without question. It wasn't about money. It was about control, the strange, calming rhythm of sight, breath, and release. Then came the day that changed everything. A group of older boys challenged him to a contest. They lined up bottles along a wall behind an abandoned barn, 10 in total, stretching nearly 200 meters. "If you're as good as they say," one laughed, "let's see it." The boy didn't answer. He simply knelt, adjusted the scope, and fired. One by one, the bottles shattered, each a whisper of glass in the wind. When he stood up, no one said a word. They just watched him walk away. That was the day his cousin began calling him El Niño del Ojo Fino, the boy with the fine eye. A few weeks later, a black truck arrived in town. No one knew the men who stepped out, but everyone recognized the aura: pressed shirts, dark glasses, polished boots. They weren't soldiers or police. They didn't have to say who they were. The village fell silent. They went to the cantina, asked questions quietly, and left. The boy saw them only once, from a distance. One of them pointed toward him. That night, as the village slept, his cousin came to the house. He looked nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he smoked. "They heard about you," he whispered. "People from Culiacan. They pay good money for men who can shoot straight." The boy said nothing. His mother's soft humming drifted from the next room, a lullaby she'd sung since he was little. "I'm not a killer," he said. His cousin shrugged. "You don't have to be. Just protect shipments, maybe scare off enemies. Easy work, good money. You could help your family." He didn't answer that night. But he didn't sleep either. The rifle lay beside him on the floor, and through the window he watched the moon rise over the hills. The thought of leaving frightened him, not because of danger, but because of the unknown. Still, poverty has a way of silencing fear. A week later, he agreed. They met him on the edge of town at dawn. Two men, both older, both polite in a strange, cold way. They gave him new clothes, black boots, dark pants, a clean shirt. One of them handed him a scope, the kind he had only seen in magazines. "You'll learn fast," the man said. "Keep your mouth shut, and you'll live long." They drove him north, past endless fields and mountains that seemed to stretch forever. That first job was simple. A truck loaded with goods, cocaine, though he didn't say the word aloud, was to cross a dirt road known for ambushes. He was told to climb a hill overlooking the route and watch for trouble. "If anyone shows up, you take them out," said the man with the scar across his face. Quick, clean, no warning. The boy climbed the hill before sunset. He could see for miles, the ribbon of road winding through the valley, the faint shimmer of heat rising from the rocks. He set up his rifle on a flat stone, adjusted the scope, and waited. Time stretched thin. The sun fell, the air cooled, and the first stars appeared. He didn't move. Then, headlights. 3 trucks coming slow, engines rumbling low. He steadied his breath, finger resting lightly on the trigger. Suddenly, another flash of light appeared on the opposite ridge, movement, just a glint, but enough. He didn't think. He aimed, exhaled, and fired. The rifle cracked like thunder. A distant figure dropped. Then silence. The convoy passed safely. When the trucks reached the other side, a man climbed the hill to meet him. He looked at the boy, at the body far below, then nodded once. "Good eye," he said. He placed a roll of pesos in the boy's pocket. "You work for us now." The boy looked down at the man he had killed. He couldn't see the face, just a shadow among shadows. His hands felt heavy, his chest hollow. Yet somewhere deep inside, he also felt something else, an eerie calm. The shot had been perfect. The stillness afterward felt familiar, almost peaceful. That night, as they drove back toward the city, he stared out the window. The desert rolled past in silver moonlight, endless and silent. He thought of his mother, of the life he had left behind, of the road that would never lead him home again. The first shot had ended his childhood. By morning, he was no longer the boy with the fine eye. He was something else, something colder, sharper, and infinitely quieter. The man who had handed him the rifle earlier smiled faintly. "You've got a gift," he said. "Now you belong to the desert." The boy looked out across the dawn and said nothing. He understood. From that moment forward, every breath, every blink, every pull of the trigger would carry him deeper into a world he could never escape. And somewhere in that vast silence between heartbeat and bullet, the legend of the Sinaloa Sniper had already begun. He remembered the day they came for him as if it were happening in slow motion, the hum of the engine, the crunch of gravel beneath tires, the morning sun spilling gold over the valley. He was 19 now, tall, quiet, and distant from the world he once knew. The rifle had made him useful, and in this part of Mexico, usefulness was both a blessing and a curse. The men who arrived weren't strangers this time. They wore clean shirts, pressed slacks, and carried themselves with the relaxed confidence of those who feared nothing. They spoke softly, smiled too easily, but their eyes were cold, sharp as blades. The boy, no longer quite a boy, was repairing a fence when one of them stepped out of the truck. "We've heard good things," the man said, leaning on the hood. "You can shoot." He nodded, saying nothing. The man smiled. "Good. The boss has work for you." There was no negotiation, no request. It wasn't a job offer, it was a path being drawn beneath his feet. The man tossed a folded bill toward him, enough money to feed his family for months. "We leave at dawn. Pack light." Then they drove off, leaving a trail of dust that lingered in the air long after the sound of the engine faded. That night, his mother begged him not to go. She had seen too many sons leave this way, quiet, determined, and never return. Her voice cracked as she clutched his hands. "There's no coming back from that world," she whispered. "Once you walk into it, it never lets you go." He said nothing. What words could he offer? Hunger had already decided for him. At dawn, he climbed into the back of the truck, carrying only his rifle, a small bag, and the silent promise that he would return. The road twisted through valleys and canyons until the landscape turned to pure dust. They stopped at a ranch deep in the hills, hidden behind a maze of dry trees and watchtowers. There were guards everywhere, men with radios, rifles, and gold chains glinting in the sun. Inside the compound, time seemed to move differently. Orders were given softly, not shouted. The men were disciplined, precise, almost military. It wasn't chaos like he had imagined, it was structure, an empire disguised as silence. He was introduced to a man named El Gordo, a thick-bodied lieutenant who served as the local commander. "The boss is like loyal people," El Gordo said, his voice calm but heavy. "You do what we ask, you get paid. You talk, you disappear. Understand?" He nodded again. That night, they showed him the perimeter, a stretch of desert and scrub where shipments would pass. His job was simple: cover the route from above, watch for movement, and signal if anything seemed wrong. "You're not here to kill," said one of the older guards, adjusting his hat. "You're here to keep the killing away." The boy took his position on a ridge overlooking the dirt road. He lay flat beneath the stars, rifle resting on a folded blanket, eyes scanning the horizon. The desert was quiet except for the soft hum of cicadas and the occasional cry of an owl. Hours passed like minutes. He thought about his mother, about the small home that now felt like another life. Near midnight, headlights appeared in the distance. A convoy of 3 trucks moved slowly, their engines barely audible. He felt his pulse steady, his breathing slow. Through the scope, he saw nothing unusual, until he noticed the faint glint of metal in the rocks above the road. A reflection, quick and sharp. Instinct took over. He adjusted his aim, shifted a degree to the left, and fired once. The flash vanished. The trucks rolled on unharmed. When the men returned to the camp at dawn, El Gordo was waiting. "You saw them?" he asked. The sniper nodded. "Then you saved us a lot of trouble." He handed him a small envelope filled with cash. "Eat, rest, and remember, you're one of us now." The days turned into weeks. The young marksman learned the rhythm of cartel life, long stretches of stillness, sudden bursts of violence, and endless secrecy. He was paid in cash, food, and silence. He slept in a small shack near the edge of the compound, his rifle always within reach. Sometimes he trained new recruits, showing them how to breathe through the trigger, how to let the wind carry the bullet. Most of them were impatient, loud, eager to prove themselves. He hated that. The rifle is not about power, he told them quietly. It's about patience. One afternoon, during a delivery run, the convoy came under fire near the foothills. The first bullet hit the windshield of the lead truck. The driver panicked, spinning into a ditch. The young sniper rolled from the back of the vehicle, rifle in hand, scanning the ridge line. He spotted movement, 3 silhouettes darting between rocks. Calmly, methodically, he took aim. One shot. Then another. And another. Silence followed. When it was over, the men in the convoy looked at him differently. Respect mixed with something else, fear. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He just reloaded, sat down on the bumper, and waited for the next order. By nightfall, the story had already begun to spread. The boy who killed without missing. The one who stayed calm while others screamed. El Gordo called him El Ángel del Polvo, the angel of dust. But angels fall, too. As his reputation grew, so did the weight on his conscience. Some nights he would stare into the fire, feeling the heat on his skin but not its warmth. The faces of the men he had killed began to blur into one another. They haunted him not in dreams, but in silence, in that empty space after the gunfire, when the desert seemed to listen. He wrote letters to his mother that he never sent, describing the stars, the mountains, the quiet. He never mentioned the gunfire. He told himself he was protecting her, but deep down, he knew he was protecting himself, from her disappointment, from the truth of what he had become. Then came the first visit from El Jeef. The boss himself. The man whose name carried weight like thunder. He arrived in a convoy of black trucks, surrounded by armed men. When he stepped out, the air seemed to still. He wasn't loud or cruel. His power came from calm. He looked at the young sniper, nodded once, and said, "I've heard of you. Keep my people safe." Those 5 words sealed his fate. From that day on, he was no longer just a lookout or a guard. He became the unseen guardian of the Sinaloa cartel, the man who protected its leaders from the shadows. He would watch over meetings, patrol mountaintops, and wait for orders that came like whispers on the wind. He told himself he wasn't killing for greed. He was killing for balance, for protection, for something greater than himself. But each time he looked through the scope, the line between protector and predator blurred a little more. Somewhere in the darkness of the hills, the boy he once was began to fade, replaced by a figure carved from silence and precision, a man who could make death look almost peaceful. And as the night fell once more over the Sinaloa desert, he realized he was no longer just guarding the cartel. He was guarding his own place in a world built on shadows, a marksman bound by loyalty, haunted by memory, and watched over only by the indifferent stars. The morning after the ambush, the valley was unusually quiet. Smoke still drifted from the wreckage of the burned-out trucks, curling upward like the ghosts of those who had fallen. The air smelled of metal, dust, and blood. He sat on the back of a jeep, cleaning his rifle, his hands steady, his face unreadable. Around him, the other men whispered, not about the attack, but about him. They said he had seen death coming before anyone else did. That he had fired before the enemy even raised their guns. He didn't correct them. Myths were safer than truth in this world. Truth could get you killed. Later that day, El Gordo approached, carrying a phone. "The boss wants to see you," he said, his tone a mix of pride and caution. Few men were summoned directly. He followed without a word. Inside the main building, a converted ranch house, the air was cool, the walls lined with polished wood and maps marked in red ink. In the center of the room sat El Jeef, calm as a storm waiting to happen. His presence alone silenced every conversation. You did well, Jeef said, not looking up from his desk. 3 dead, none of ours. That's rare. The sniper gave a small nod. Compliments meant little here. They were tests wrapped in kindness. Jeef finally raised his eyes. I don't like waste. You're precise. That means you understand discipline. I have need for that. He leaned back, folding his hands. From now on, you'll be with my detail. Close protection. When I travel, you travel. When I sleep, you watch. The word struck him like a quiet thunderclap. This wasn't an offer, it was a command that changed everything. It meant more money, more access, and more danger. He was moving from the outskirts of the organization to its burning core. That night, as he lay awake in his bunk, he could hear the distant laughter of the guards, the hum of generators, the soft whine of radios carrying coded chatter. The world outside the compound felt far away now. He wondered if his mother still waited at the door every evening, or if she had finally accepted that her son belonged to the silence of the hills. Days blurred into weeks. He traveled with Jeef's convoy, black SUVs slicing through the dust like shadows. Each trip followed the same rhythm, long drives, short meetings, tense silences. They would arrive at distant ranches or coastal villas, where men in expensive suits greeted them with false smiles and trembling hands. Deals were made, loyalties exchanged, and sometimes, disappearances followed. His role was always the same, unseen, distant, watching from rooftops or hillsides. The rifle became an extension of his body, his heartbeat sinking with its weight. He had learned long ago that emotion was a liability. You don't shoot angry. You don't hesitate. You simply exist in that narrow space between breath and death, where the world holds still. But the silence began to change him. The more he watched through the scope, the less human the world seemed. Every face became a target, every shadow a threat. He didn't feel fear anymore, only calculation. And that terrified him, not because he had become a killer, but because he no longer recognized the man who stared back from the reflection in his rifle barrel. One afternoon, while stationed above a meeting site in the desert, he spotted movement on a distant ridge, a glint of light, just like the one that had once betrayed another ambush. Without thinking, he adjusted his scope and fired. The echo rolled through the canyon. When the dust settled, the figure lay still. But when they reached the body later, it wasn't a rival or a scout. It was a boy, 15, maybe 16, carrying binoculars and a half-eaten apple. One of the locals, hired to watch for police patrols. El Gordo's voice was low when he said, he was one of ours. The sniper said nothing. The others waited for a reaction, but his face didn't move. He just turned, walked back to his post, and cleaned his weapon until his fingers hurt. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the campfire, watching the flames twist and break apart, each spark fading like the flash of a rifle shot. The next morning, Jeef called him into the main house again. It was a mistake. The boss said, lighting a cigar. It happens. What matters is that you keep control. Guilt is for priests, not soldiers. The sniper stood still. Yes, sir. Jeef leaned forward, studying his face. You remind me of myself when I was your age. Quiet. Efficient. Dangerous. He exhaled a long stream of smoke. But remember this, the moment you hesitate, you die. The world doesn't forgive hesitation. After that, something in him began to harden. He no longer counted the days, or the lives. His movements became mechanical: eat, clean, aim, fire, sleep. He started carrying a small notebook, jotting coordinates, wind speeds, distances, not names. Never names. But deep within him, a fracture was forming. Sometimes, when he looked through the scope, he saw the boy's face again, not in guilt, but as a reminder that even precision carried a price. And though the men around him praised his calm, he began to realize that calm was just another word for emptiness. One evening, as the convoy prepared to leave for another meeting, El Gordo handed him a folded map. "We're heading to the mountains. Jeef doesn't trust the roads. You'll take point from above." He nodded, though something in his gut twisted. The mountains meant isolation, long stretches with no radio contact, no backup, and no forgiveness if something went wrong. That night, as he climbed into position under a sky full of broken stars, he felt the weight of everything he'd become pressing down like the rifle on his shoulder. The desert wind cut through his jacket, sharp and cold. Below him, headlights moved like fireflies through the darkness. He lay flat, breathing slow, waiting for the signal. Somewhere deep inside, a question flickered, not about survival, but about purpose. Was he still protecting something? Or just preserving the illusion that he was more than a weapon? The convoy stopped. The engines died. The world went still. He peered through the scope one last time, and for the first time in years, he hesitated. The wind shifted. The silence stretched. And somewhere in that silence, he began to sense that everything he had built, every bullet, every breath of control, was leading him toward a truth he was not ready to face. Because in a world ruled by shadows, even angels fall, but not all of them know it when they do. The Sinaloa Cartel was no longer a whisper in the desert, it was an empire stretching across mountains, rivers, and borders. From the coast of Mazatlan to the hills of Culiacan, its influence was everywhere, invisible yet undeniable. The young sniper watched it all from a distance at first, scanning the horizon from ridges and rooftops, the rifle resting lightly in his hands, his eyes trained to notice the faintest shift in shadow or movement. It was a golden era for the cartel, a time when men like Guzman, Zambada, and a few others consolidated power, turning smuggling routes into arteries of wealth that pulsed with danger. He remembered the first time he saw Guzman in person. The boss walked slowly through the compound, confident but not flashy, his eyes calculating, his presence commanding even the most hardened lieutenants to bow slightly in acknowledgement. The sniper didn't approach, didn't need to. Guzman didn't glance his way, but the air around him seemed to acknowledge that a guardian was watching, someone precise, patient, and invisible. That was the way of the desert, silence spoke louder than words. The sniper's days blended together. He traveled on convoys laden with goods, shipments of cocaine, sometimes cash, sometimes both, and he learned the rhythm of the empire. Trucks rolled down dirt roads at dawn, winding between scrub hills and riverbeds, while he and a small team stationed themselves on surrounding ridges. Hours passed like minutes as he lay flat, scanning for threats, his scope an extension of his own sight. He learned to read movement, a shadow that lingered too long, a glint of metal under the moon, the way dust rose in unnatural patterns. He became so attuned to his environment that even the desert itself seemed to whisper warnings. This was a time of expansion. The cartel reached out to Colombian suppliers, trading shipments and forming alliances that brought even greater wealth. Private ranches became fortified compounds, guarded by men trained in both violence and secrecy. The sniper watched over these places, sometimes for days at a stretch, hidden among rocks and trees, unmoving, feeding on water and the small rations packed by his handlers. Nights were long and cold, filled with wind that carried distant howls, but the rifle never left his side. Every mission reinforced a silent truth, his value lay not in fear, but in precision. He became a ghost among men. Cartel lieutenants spoke of him in hushed tones, always careful to avoid attracting attention. El Angel, they called him quietly, the angel who watched over the bosses. They told stories of how he had saved Guzman from ambushes, taking out gunmen before they even drew their weapons. Some exaggerated the feats, others understated them. But all agreed on one thing: he never hesitated, he never missed, and he never revealed himself. The sniper's personal code held firm even as the empire expanded. He never killed for pleasure, never took unnecessary risks, and never involved civilians. When new recruits bristled with eagerness, he would show them how to steady their hands, how to breathe with the wind, how to wait for the exact right moment before letting the rifle speak. Many of them failed, few understood. But he did not scold them loudly. Patience, he had learned, was more powerful than anger. With every mission, his reputation grew. Stories circulated that he could strike a moving target from incredible distances, that he never missed under pressure, and that he had eyes that seemed to see through the night. But the sniper remained unseen. He did not mingle with the men he protected. He did not celebrate victories. His presence was felt only in the absence of disaster. Yet even as the empire thrived, danger never vanished. Rival cartels moved in waves across the borders, raiding convoys, ambushing shipments, and testing the defenses of the Sinaloa cartel. Every time there was a threat, the sniper was there, perched high above the chaos, pulling back the world into order one measured shot at a time. He became a legend among his peers, a necessary phantom who ensured that the Kingpins could operate with confidence, even when enemies lurked just beyond the ridges. In the evenings, he would sometimes watch the sunset from his hidden perch, the horizon bleeding gold and crimson over the mountains. He thought of the past, of the boy who had hunted rabbits for food, who had learned to track the smallest movements in the shadows of the desert. That boy was gone now, replaced by a man forged from silence, skill, and necessity. Yet even with all his prowess, he carried the quiet weight of lives taken, of choices made, and of loyalty demanded. The sniper's connection to the empire was both intimate and distant. He knew Guzman only by sight, only through the occasional instructions delivered by lieutenants. Yet he understood the rhythm of the man's operations better than anyone else. Every deal, every convoy, every shift in the cartel's alliances mattered, and the sniper adapted silently, anticipating threats before they materialized. This golden era was intoxicating in its own way. The power of the cartel radiated outward, touching villages, towns, and cities alike. Money flowed like water, influence spread like wildfire, and the men at the top moved almost untouchably, protected by a fortress of fear, strategy, and loyal shadows. The sniper had become one of those shadows, unseen yet indispensable. But beneath the wealth and expansion, tension simmered. The sniper could sense it, whispers of betrayal, rival factions pressing in, law enforcement probing ever closer. Every mission required more caution, every ambush demanded sharper instincts. The stakes were higher than ever before. The golden era was not endless, it was fragile, like a reflection in a pool of water waiting to shatter. Even as the empire flourished, he remained alone. Nights in the desert grew colder, moments of stillness stretched longer, and every shot fired carried more consequence. He had become a necessary instrument of the cartel's survival, a silent guardian who shaped the empire without ever stepping into the light. In those long, quiet hours, he thought often of the boy who had first lifted a rifle in the Sinaloa hills. That boy had only wanted to feed his family, to survive, to understand the world around him. Now, the man he had become existed in a larger, more dangerous landscape, guarding kings and navigating shadows. He had traded innocence for precision, childhood for silence, and he bore the weight of that trade with the same calm that guided his hand. And as the desert wind swept across the ridges and valleys, carrying the faint scent of dust, blood, and distant fires, the sniper watched over the empire. Every shot, every vigil, every breath of wind became part of the unspoken narrative of power, the rise of the Sinaloa cartel, guided, in part, by a man who never sought fame, who never craved recognition, but whose presence ensured that the empire endured in the golden light of its peak. The night fell like a curtain over the Sinaloa hills, bringing with it a quiet that seemed heavier than the day's heat. The sniper lay flat among the scrub, the rifle cradled in his hands, and watched the road wind through the valley like a black ribbon. From this vantage point, he could see the convoy approaching, trucks carrying goods, men, and money, their headlights flickering like tiny stars lost in the desert. He adjusted his scope, scanning every shadow, every movement, the cool night air brushing against his skin. It had been months since he joined El Jeef's inner circle, months of long drives, endless vigils, and shots fired with a precision that had begun to feel almost ritualistic. He had become the invisible guardian of the cartel's most valuable assets. And yet, he had begun to feel a strange tension, a subtle unease that the desert could not explain. It was the whisper of change, the faint sense that the empire he served so faithfully was not as untouchable as it seemed. The convoy moved slowly, deliberately, as though it sensed the eyes watching from above. He traced their movements through the scope, noting the smallest details, a taillight slightly cracked, a tire worn on one side, a driver's glance into the rearview mirror. Everything mattered. Every detail could mean life or death. He inhaled, exhaled, and held himself still, feeling the pulse of the night synchronize with his own heartbeat. Suddenly, movement on the distant ridge caught his attention. Shadows shifting too quickly, unnatural in the calm of the desert. His finger moved to the trigger, not in panic, but in anticipation. One shot, he told himself. One shot to correct the world. He fired, and the echo rolled across the canyons like distant thunder. When the dust settled, the threat was gone. The convoy continued unscathed. As he descended from the ridge to report, he felt the weight of his role pressing against him more than ever. He was no longer just a marksman, he was a symbol, a silent guarantor of the cartel's survival. Each shot he took shaped the empire, each decision he made rippled through the network of men, money, and power. And with that responsibility came a constant, gnawing awareness that one mistake, one hesitation, could unravel everything. The days and nights blurred together. Convoys moved along dusty roads, shipments crossed borders, and rivals tested their defenses with bold attacks that ended quickly, often without knowing who had thwarted them. The sniper became the unseen hand of destiny, his presence felt but never acknowledged. Men whispered his name softly, El Angel, the angel, but he never responded. Recognition was dangerous, silence was survival. He began to notice subtle changes among the men around him. New recruits were eager, reckless, and loud. Veterans moved cautiously, weighed down by suspicion. Even loyal lieutenants glanced at him differently, as if aware that the sniper's aim was sharper than anyone's understanding of loyalty. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first seeds of a question he had never allowed himself to ask: how long could this continue? One afternoon, during a transport through the mountain passes, the convoy came under fire. Bullets raked the lead truck, sparks flying as metal met metal. The sniper positioned himself on a ridge overlooking the ambush. He could see the assailants clearly now, men moving with deadly purpose, unaware of the eyes that tracked every motion. He fired shot after shot, each one precise, each one deliberate. Within moments, the attackers were neutralized, the convoy continued its journey, and the men inside barely realized how close they had come to death. Later, in the safety of a hidden ranch, he cleaned his rifle in silence. The others spoke in hushed tones about the attack, marveling at the sniper's skill. "He never misses," one lieutenant whispered. "It's like he knows before they move." The sniper said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The desert, the rifles, the targets, they spoke a language older than any conversation. At night, he would climb to the highest point of the compound, the wind carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and distant fire. The stars stretched endlessly above him, and he imagined the world beyond the mountains, cities full of life, streets without shadows, families untouched by fear. But those were dreams he could not indulge in. His reality was the ridge, the scope, and the knowledge that his hand controlled the delicate balance between survival and annihilation. With each passing month, the cartel's operations grew more complex. International shipments, money laundering, alliances with other cartels, each required vigilance, each required eyes that never blinked. He had become those eyes. Sometimes he wondered if the men he protected knew what they owed to the shadow in the hills. Probably not. And that was exactly as it should be. One evening, LG visited the compound personally. The sniper watched him from a distance, noting the calm authority in the way he moved, the quiet power that radiated without force. The boss approached the perimeter, glanced at the sniper's position, and nodded subtly. That gesture said more than any words could. The sniper was trusted, indispensable, yet invisible. A guardian who would remain silent, whether noticed or not. He began to notice subtle patterns in the enemy's movements, the way rival factions adapted, the way whispers of betrayal moved like wind through the ranks. Each threat required not just skill, but patience, calculation, and above all, restraint. He learned to anticipate, to predict, to move without being seen. The desert became his ally, the mountains his fortress, and the rifle an extension of his own consciousness. And yet, even in the midst of precision, there were moments of quiet reflection. Nights spent beneath the stars, with only the wind as companion, reminded him of the boy he once was, hunting rabbits to feed his family, waiting for the first light to touch the hills. That boy seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by a figure carved from shadows and steel, a man who moved through life with the certainty of inevitability. The legend of the Sinaloa Sniper grew. Stories whispered in cantinas and along dusty roads spoke of a man who could protect convoys, foresee ambushes, and eliminate threats with supernatural accuracy. Some said he was untouchable, that no one could find him. Others claimed he was more than human, a ghost of the desert sent to punish those who crossed the cartel. But he was neither legend nor myth. He was a man who understood the weight of his rifle, the silence of the night, and the fragile balance of power. He knew that each shot, each decision, each long hour spent waiting in the desert carried consequences far beyond the moment. And as he watched another convoy disappear into the horizon, headlights fading into the darkness, he allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement: he was no longer the boy who had first lifted a rifle in the Sinaloa hills. He was a guardian, a shadow, a force unseen but undeniable, and he would remain so, perched between the light and the darkness, until the empire no longer needed him, or until the desert finally took him into its endless silence. The desert was quiet that morning, a stillness that felt almost unnatural after months of constant vigilance. The sniper perched on his usual ridge, the rifle resting lightly against his shoulder, eyes tracing the winding dirt road below. From this height, he could see every detail: the convoy approaching in the distance, the subtle shimmer of heat over the rocks, the faint movement of dust stirred by the wheels. It had become almost routine, yet each moment carried the tension of possibility. A rival cartel could appear, an ambush could erupt, or a traitor could strike from within. Months had passed since he first joined the inner circle of the Sinaloa cartel, and in that time, he had become something more than a marksman. He was the unseen shield, the silent guardian whose skill ensured that the leaders could operate with a rare confidence. He moved like a shadow, observed like the wind, and fired with a precision that had begun to seem almost supernatural. Men around him spoke of him quietly, with reverence and a touch of fear. El Ángel, they called him, the angel who watched, who protected, who never revealed himself. That morning, the sniper's thoughts drifted briefly to his childhood, to the boy who had hunted rabbits to feed his family, who had practiced with slingshots under the scorching sun. That boy had learned patience, patience that now served him in a world far more dangerous and far more complex. But even as he reflected, the world demanded his attention. The convoy was moving slower than usual, careful as it wound through the hills. Something was off. The slightest detail caught his eye: a shadow that lingered too long among the rocks, a glint that did not belong. Instinct sharpened, he adjusted the scope. The scope became an extension of his mind, translating movement, distance, and wind into a language only he could understand. He had seen this before, the telltale signs of an ambush. The pulse of the desert seemed to quicken, the heat of anticipation rising even in the cool morning air. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, waiting for the exact moment when intervention would be required. Suddenly, a vehicle appeared, its tires crunching on gravel in a pattern that did not match the convoy. It was a scout, testing, probing. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger, not yet pulling, observing, calculating. He could see the men inside, their movements anxious, their glances darting toward the ridge line. One wrong step, one twitch, and the balance of the moment could collapse into chaos. He remained still, invisible, a part of the landscape itself. Then the signal came, subtle, almost imperceptible, a hand gesture from a fellow lookout. The moment had arrived. The sniper fired, one shot, then another, the bullets striking with quiet inevitability. The enemy scouts were neutralized before they could alert anyone else. The convoy continued, unaware of the danger that had passed mere feet away. The desert swallowed the sound of gunfire, leaving only the lingering echo in the canyon and the faint scent of spent powder on the wind. Back at the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, each movement deliberate, almost ritualistic. The other men spoke in hushed tones about the morning's events, marveling at the sniper's skill. "He sees before we even know there is danger," one lieutenant whispered. The sniper said nothing. Words were unnecessary. His presence, his discipline, and his precision were enough to protect the empire. But even as his legend grew, he remained a solitary figure. Nights were the hardest, long hours perched in the hills, watching the world unfold from a distance, the rifle always ready. He thought of his mother sometimes, of the home he had left behind, of the boy who had first lifted a rifle without understanding the world he was stepping into. That boy seemed almost a stranger now, a ghost in the edges of his memory. The empire itself was evolving. Guzman and the leaders were expanding operations, forging alliances, and consolidating power across regions. The sniper moved within this growing web, always above, always unseen, guiding the flow of events with the quiet certainty of his aim. Each convoy he protected, each threat he neutralized, reinforced the fragile structure of an empire built on fear, loyalty, and secrecy. Yet with each success came the burden of awareness. He knew that the golden age of the cartel could not last forever. Rivals watched, law enforcement probed, and within the organization, whispers of betrayal occasionally surfaced. The sniper had learned to anticipate these threats, but even his skill could not erase the uncertainty that hovered at the edges of every mission. Survival required constant vigilance, patience, and sometimes, a detachment that weighed heavily on his soul. He remembered one particular evening as the sun dipped below the mountains, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson. He lay flat on a ridge, the convoy below moving through the winding road, and reflected on the years that had brought him here. From a boy hunting rabbits to feed his family, to a man perched high above the desert, controlling life and death with a single shot, his journey was as quiet as it was extraordinary. The transformation had been complete, yet invisible to anyone who did not watch the shadows closely. In the stillness, he allowed himself a fleeting thought: the desert had become both his protector and his prison. It gave him clarity, control, and purpose, but it also demanded solitude and vigilance. Each shot, each moment of silence, carried the weight of lives, his, the convoys, the enemies. Every breath taken in the desert reminded him that he was not just surviving, he was shaping the fate of an empire, one precise decision at a time. As night fell completely, stars stretching endlessly across the sky, he adjusted his scope one final time. The world below was quiet, the convoy safe, and the empire preserved for another day. And in that quiet, he felt the duality of his existence, powerful yet invisible, indispensable yet alone, a guardian perched forever between light and shadow. The Sinaloa Sniper had become more than a man, he had become a force, unseen, unwavering, and eternal in the stillness of the desert. The desert night stretched endlessly, a velvet canopy of stars above the Sinaloa hills. The sniper lay flat against the jagged rocks, the rifle cradled in his hands, perfectly still. The convoy would pass soon, trucks laden with goods, men, and cash, their headlights piercing the darkness like the eyes of predators on the hunt. He had been on countless missions, but no two were ever truly the same. The desert had a rhythm, a pulse, and the sniper had learned to sync his own heartbeat with it, moving in the delicate space between shadow and light. Months had passed since he became part of the inner circle, since El Jeef had entrusted him with the safety of the most important men in the cartel. Every day, every convoy, every ridge he occupied reinforced a silent truth: he existed to observe, to protect, and, if necessary, to destroy without hesitation. The men around him whispered his name softly, El Angel, but he remained unseen. He did not walk among them, did not share in their meals or their laughter. He was a ghost, a shadow that moved with the wind and struck with precision. That evening, the convoy rolled through the hills later than usual. Suspicious. The sniper's eyes traced every movement, noting the subtle irregularities, a dust plume that lingered longer than expected, the uneven spacing between trucks, a glint of metal in the scrub. Instinct whispered danger. The sniper adjusted his scope, the cold metal comforting against his cheek. A figure appeared on a distant ridge, crouched low among the rocks. A rival scout, perhaps, or a deserter with a grudge. He could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the nervous glances toward the road below. The sniper did not move. He waited. Patience, he had learned, was as deadly as the rifle itself. One false move could ruin everything, one premature shot could reveal his presence. Minutes stretched like hours. The scout shifted, and the sniper's finger lightly brushed the trigger. Then he fired. The shot cracked through the night, precise and final. The figure collapsed into the shadows. The convoy passed safely, oblivious to the danger that had threatened to tear it apart. Back at the compound, he cleaned the rifle with methodical care. The men around him spoke in hushed tones of the morning's event, their voices tinged with awe and fear. "He's not human," one said quietly. "It's like he sees before we even know danger exists." The sniper did not respond. Words were useless. The rifle, the ridge, the desert, they were his language, and he had mastered it. His solitude deepened with every mission. Nights were spent perched in the hills, observing, waiting, breathing with the rhythm of the world below. He thought often of the boy he had once been, the one who had hunted rabbits to feed his family, who had learned the patience of the hunt in quiet dawns. That boy was a distant echo now, replaced by a man carved from shadows, who understood that survival was measured in calm observation and exacting precision. The empire he protected was expanding, its influence stretching beyond Sinaloa into distant territories. Allies were made, deals were sealed, and enemies tested the cartel's strength with bold attacks. Each time, the sniper moved silently above the chaos, his rifle an extension of his will. The men he guarded might never know his name, but his impact was undeniable. He shaped outcomes without stepping into the light. Despite his skill and invisibility, the weight of his actions pressed heavily on him. Every shot carried consequence, every moment of inaction could cost lives. The desert seemed to reflect this duality, endless beauty and deadly threat intertwined. He began to understand the paradox of his existence: he was powerful and vital, yet utterly alone. The rifles, the hills, the night, they were constant, but human connection was fragile and dangerous in his world. One afternoon, a rival faction attempted a coordinated attack along a known smuggling route. The sniper was already in position, hidden among boulders overlooking the pass. He could see their movements clearly, men moving with practiced aggression, rifles raised, eyes scanning the valley below. Without hesitation, he fired. Each shot was precise, disabling vehicles, neutralizing threats, and protecting the convoy. Within moments, the ambush had failed, the attackers retreating into the desert with losses they would not soon forget. When the convoy reached safety, the lieutenants glanced at him with awe, careful not to speak his name aloud. Their trust in him was absolute. They understood that without him, their operations would be far more dangerous, their lives far more fragile. And yet, he remained distant, a silent sentinel whose presence was felt but never seen. Nights became longer, solitude deeper. He often climbed to the highest points, rifle in hand, watching the stars and contemplating the world below. He thought of the boy he had been, of the first rabbit he had hunted, of the first man he had killed to protect the convoy. Those memories were not regrets, they were markers of transformation. Each step, each shot, had carved him into the man who now existed only in shadows. The sniper had become more than a protector, he was a symbol of precision and inevitability, a quiet force upon which the empire depended. His eyes traced every ridge, every road, every movement of the desert as though reading an ancient language. He had learned to anticipate, to calculate, to strike before the threat even fully emerged. The desert itself had become part of him, patient, silent, and deadly. And yet, even as he perfected his craft, a subtle awareness persisted. The world he had entered, the empire he protected, was built on fragile lines of loyalty and fear. One misstep, one moment of distraction, and all could collapse. He understood this better than anyone. His vigilance had become a necessity, a constant companion that defined every breath, every heartbeat, every movement. As the convoy disappeared into the horizon, headlights fading into the darkness, the sniper remained on his ridge, watching, waiting. The night was deep, the stars endless, and the desert quiet. He felt the weight of his role, indispensable, unseen, eternal in its silence. The Sinaloa Sniper had become more than a man, he was the unseen hand that held the empire together, perched between the light and the shadows, guiding the fate of men who might never even know his name. And in that quiet, under the vast expanse of the desert sky, he allowed himself a fleeting acknowledgement. He was no longer the boy who had first lifted a rifle in the hills. He was a force, precise, patient, and unyielding, the guardian of an empire, a shadow in the night whose story would be whispered long after he was gone. The desert dawn broke slowly, spilling pale light over the jagged hills and dry riverbeds of Sinaloa. Dust shimmered in the weak morning sun, drifting lazily in the wind like tiny golden ghosts. The sniper lay flat on a rocky outcrop, rifle cradled in his hands, watching the convoy wind its way through the valley below. Months of experience had taught him that the calmest mornings often carried the gravest danger. He scanned every inch of the road, noting irregularities, a stone out of place, a branch shifted, a dust plume lingering where it should have dispersed. Each small detail could mean life or death. It had been years since he had first lifted a rifle to protect the men who would become the leaders of the Sinaloa Cartel. In that time, he had become more than a marksman. He was a guardian, an invisible presence whose precision and patience shaped the survival of an empire. He moved like a shadow across the hills, almost imperceptible, observing, calculating, waiting. Men whispered his name, El Ángel, though few had ever seen him. He did not mingle, did not celebrate victories. His work was silent, and so was he. The world of the cartel had grown increasingly complex. Operations expanded into foreign territories, alliances were negotiated and tested, and rival factions challenged every route, every shipment, every deal. The sniper's role had evolved alongside this empire. He was no longer simply watching convoys, he was analyzing threats, anticipating ambushes, predicting enemy movements before they even began. Every shot he fired was calculated with the precision of a master chess player moving unseen pieces across a board. That morning, a subtle tension rippled through the hills. From his vantage point, the sniper could see movement on a distant ridge, the unnatural sway of a figure moving too carefully, too deliberately. He adjusted his scope, zooming in to identify the threat. It was a scout from a rival faction, no doubt sent to assess the convoy. The sniper's finger brushed the trigger lightly. Patience, he reminded himself. Wait for the exact moment. One shot could save the lives of dozens below. Minutes stretched, the desert air tense and electric. He tracked the scout's movements with precise calculation, noting every breath, every shift in posture. Then, at the perfect moment, he fired. The bullet struck true. The figure collapsed silently into the dust. The convoy, oblivious to the danger that had hovered so close, moved onward safely. The sniper exhaled slowly, the rhythm of his heartbeat settling back into its quiet cadence. Back at the compound, the sniper cleaned his rifle, the process almost meditative. Men whispered among themselves, speaking of the morning's event with awe and reverence. He sees before we even know, one lieutenant murmured. But the sniper remained silent. Words were unnecessary. The rifle, the desert, the ridges, they were his language. Each mission, each vigil, each precise shot reinforced his role as both guardian and unseen executor. Even in his isolation, he began to feel the weight of his actions. The lives he protected, the lives he ended, the empire he sustained, all hung in delicate balance. Nights in the desert were long and solitary, the wind carrying the faint scent of distant fires, dust, and something else, a reminder of mortality. He thought often of the boy he had been, the one who had hunted rabbits to feed his family. That boy had learned patience, but he had not understood consequence. Now, the sniper lived within consequence at every breath, every heartbeat, every movement. The cartel's leaders trusted him implicitly. Guzman, El Jeef, and others knew only that the sniper's presence guaranteed their safety. They rarely interacted with him directly, yet the impact of his vigilance was undeniable. He had become a silent architect of survival, shaping the empire from the shadows with quiet efficiency. Convoys moved, shipments crossed borders, alliances endured, all because of the precision and patience of a single, unseen man. But with power came awareness. He knew the empire was not invincible. Rivals watched, law enforcement probed, and even within the cartel, whispers of betrayal moved like shadows among the men. The sniper anticipated these threats, positioning himself always one step ahead, yet he knew that vigilance alone was not enough. Every mission carried the possibility of failure, every shot the weight of irreversible consequence. One afternoon, a convoy moving through a canyon came under attack. Rival gunmen struck from hidden positions, bullets ricocheting off rocks and metal. The sniper, already in position on a ridge above, assessed the situation calmly. He fired with methodical precision, neutralizing threats one by one. Within moments, the ambush had failed, the convoy continued safely, and the attackers fled, unaware of the ghostly figure that had ensured their defeat. As he descended from his perch, he reflected on the paradox of his existence. He was both indispensable and invisible, powerful yet solitary. The desert had become both ally and confine, offering clarity, control, and the constant reminder of fragility. Each shot, each moment of stillness, each night spent beneath the stars reinforced the reality that his life was entwined irrevocably with the empire he served. Even in moments of rest, he could not fully escape the rhythm of vigilance. The desert whispered, shadows moved, and the future was always uncertain. He thought of the boy he had once been, of innocence traded for precision, for survival, for the quiet but weighty power of a man who existed only in the stillness between light and darkness. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the hills in muted gold and crimson, he adjusted his scope one last time. The convoy had disappeared into the distance, the empire remained intact for another day, and the Sinaloa Sniper remained, silent, unseen, patient, and eternal in the shadows. His story, like the desert wind, would move unseen yet leave its mark on everything it touched. The mountains of Sinaloa were cloaked in a pale mist that morning, the air carrying the faint scent of dust, sage, and the faint tang of gunpowder from the previous night's drills. The sniper crouched behind a jagged outcrop, his rifle resting lightly in his hands, as though it were an extension of his body rather than a weapon. Below him, a convoy made its slow, deliberate way through the winding valleys, unaware of the invisible guardian who watched every motion, every ripple of dust, every subtle shift in the landscape that might signal danger. By now, his role in the cartel had become almost second nature. He was no longer simply a marksman, he was a sentinel, a shadow that maintained the delicate balance of life and death for men whose faces he rarely saw up close. Months turned into years, and the sniper's presence was woven into the very operations of the empire. Trucks rolled down dirt roads as if guided by an unseen hand, and enemies learned, either through myth or direct consequence, that any threat within the sniper's line of sight was likely to end before it even began. That morning, he scanned the ridge opposite the convoy, noting subtle movements that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. A branch shifting too quickly, a shadow moving against the slope of a hill, a glint of metal just beyond the scrub. Each anomaly was a potential threat. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger. He waited, breathing with deliberate slowness, feeling the pulse of the desert synchronize with his own heartbeat. This was a rhythm he had mastered over countless nights and days, a dance between anticipation and action that required complete stillness. In the distance, he noticed a group of figures moving against the horizon. They were clearly scouts, their movements careful but nervous, their attention focused entirely on the convoy below. He studied their pattern, predicting their next steps with the accuracy that had earned him the nickname El Angel. Time stretched, the desert quiet except for the soft whistle of wind through the rocks. And then, with perfect precision, he fired. Bullets struck true, neutralizing the threat before it could reach the road. The convoy remained unscathed, oblivious to the danger that had almost struck them down. As the convoy moved safely beyond the ridge, the sniper allowed himself a moment of reflection. His life had become a series of such moments, perched above the world, eyes scanning, hands steady, every decision critical. He had traded his childhood for skill, his innocence for discipline, and his solitude for the certainty of control. He thought of the boy he had been, hunting rabbits in the desert to feed his family, and marveled at the distance traveled between that life and the one he now led. The empire itself was growing, expanding its reach beyond the familiar hills and valleys. Operations stretched into distant towns, alliances were forged and tested, and rival factions became bolder. Each development demanded vigilance, and the sniper adapted. He learned to anticipate not only attacks but also the subtle undercurrents of betrayal and greed that flowed through the organization. Every convoy he protected, every mission he completed, reinforced the delicate web of power upon which the cartel relied. Yet, even as he excelled, he could feel the weight of his actions pressing down upon him. Each shot fired, each life taken or spared, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long, often spent perched alone under the stars, and the solitude began to gnaw at the edges of his consciousness. Memories of faces lost in previous missions, men, rivals, even innocents caught in the crossfire, floated unbidden, a quiet reminder that precision came at a cost. Despite this, he remained focused, disciplined. He did not falter. He did not allow emotion to dictate action. The rifle in his hands was an extension of his will, the desert a mirror of his patience. Every mission demanded more than skill, it demanded understanding, of the terrain, of human behavior, and of the fragile threads that held an empire together. One miscalculation could unravel everything, and he knew it. Over time, he became more than a sniper. He became a symbol, a ghostly presence whose efficiency and vigilance ensured that the Sinaloa cartel remained one step ahead of both rivals and law enforcement. Stories of his exploits circulated quietly among men who had never seen him. El Angel, they whispered. Some spoke of him as a myth, others as a force beyond human comprehension. But the sniper himself remained unaffected by legend. He did not seek recognition, he did not crave praise. His satisfaction lay in the rhythm of the mission, the success of the operation, and the safety of those he was charged to protect. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, the sniper shifted slightly to catch the last rays of light on a distant peak. He reflected on the strange duality of his existence. He was powerful, indispensable, yet utterly alone. The desert had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where he could exercise control over life and death, yet one where human connection was a dangerous liability. He allowed himself a quiet thought of the boy he had been, and acknowledged that the innocence lost had been traded for mastery, for survival, for purpose. As darkness fell, he prepared for the night's vigil. The convoy would travel again, and he would take position, perched above the world, waiting, watching, ready. Each mission, each ridge, each long hour of stillness became part of the unbroken chain of protection he provided. He understood the fragile balance of power, the weight of loyalty, and the necessity of silence. And so he waited, under the stars, the wind brushing against his skin, the rifle resting comfortably in his hands. The world below moved through its patterns, unaware of the guardian perched in shadow. He felt the quiet satisfaction of purpose fulfilled and the subtle burden of responsibility carried alone. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, unseen, unwavering, eternal, a shadow between light and darkness, guiding, protecting, and shaping the fate of an empire that depended on his invisible hand. In that quiet moment, he understood fully what it meant to be both man and myth. He was more than a marksman, more than a protector, he was a force whose presence determined the survival of kings and the collapse of empires. The desert whispered around him, carrying with it the knowledge that his story was not written in words or songs, but in silence, precision, and the unseen guidance of a rifle that had become a part of him, inseparable, eternal. The early morning sun cast long, pale shadows across the Sinaloa hills, turning jagged rocks into ghostly silhouettes and painting the valleys with muted gold. The sniper lay perfectly still among the desert scrub, the rifle resting lightly against his shoulder, his eye pressed to the scope. Below him, a convoy wound its way through the narrow canyon roads, oblivious to the unseen guardian perched high above. The silence of the desert was almost tangible, broken only by the soft crunch of tires against gravel and the whisper of wind through the sparse vegetation. In that stillness, the sniper felt the weight of the world pressing down, the lives he was responsible for, the empire he protected, and the fragile balance that could shatter in a single instant. Years had passed since he had joined the inner circle of the Sinaloa Cartel, yet each day demanded the same vigilance, patience, and precision as the first. He had become a master of observation, able to anticipate threats before they fully materialized. Shadows, dust plumes, glints of metal, each small detail carried meaning, each movement a potential signal of danger. The sniper's senses had become finely tuned instruments, his mind and body operating in perfect synchrony with the rhythm of the desert and the convoy below. He remembered the early days, when his responsibilities were limited and the stakes were smaller. He had learned to read the landscape, to track movement across uneven terrain, to adjust for wind and distance, and to remain motionless for hours on end. Every lesson had been a step toward mastery, every mission a test of patience and skill. Now, with the empire expanded and rivals testing its strength at every turn, the precision he had honed became indispensable. That morning, as he scanned the distant ridge opposite the convoy, a subtle movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from the shadow of rocks, moving cautiously, almost deliberately. The sniper studied the man's posture, the way he shifted his weight, the angle of his head. A rival scout, no doubt, sent to evaluate the convoy. He exhaled slowly, letting the desert silence fill his awareness, and waited. Timing was everything. One shot, perfectly placed, could neutralize the threat without endangering anyone below. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The scout's movements became slightly erratic, revealing nervousness and uncertainty. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing steady, his body still. Then, at the precise moment, he fired. The bullet struck true, the threat eliminated before it could alert anyone to its presence. The convoy continued its journey, untouched and unaware of the danger that had almost struck them down. The desert absorbed the sound of the shot, leaving only the faint smell of spent powder and the whisper of the wind. Back at the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical care. The men around him spoke in hushed tones of the morning's events, their voices tinged with awe and fear. "He sees before we even know," one lieutenant murmured. The sniper did not respond. Words were unnecessary. His work spoke for itself. Each mission, each ridge, each long hour of stillness reinforced his role as the silent architect of survival. Despite the growing efficiency of the cartel and his mastery of his craft, the weight of his responsibilities was heavy. Each shot fired, each decision made, carried consequences that rippled through the empire. Nights were long, often spent alone under a sky littered with stars, the wind carrying the scent of distant fires and dust. Memories of men lost, of ambushes thwarted, and of choices made in the solitude of the desert lingered quietly, a constant reminder of the fine line between success and catastrophe. Yet, in the stillness, he also found clarity. He had become more than a marksman, he was a guardian, a force whose presence ensured that the empire continued to function despite the ever-present threats from rivals, law enforcement, and betrayal from within. His observations were meticulous, his shots precise, and his patience unwavering. The desert had taught him the value of silence, of observation, and of restraint. Every detail mattered, every moment required focus, and every decision had the potential to alter the fate of the empire. The sniper often thought of the boy he had once been, hunting rabbits to feed his family. That boy had learned the importance of patience and timing, but had not yet understood the burden of consequence. Now, every mission, every ridge, every bullet fired carried far greater weight. The sniper had become a man shaped by necessity, molded by experience, and defined by the quiet precision of his craft. As the sun climbed higher, the convoy disappeared into the distance, leaving the sniper to descend from his perch. He moved with care, retracing his path through the hills, the weight of the rifle familiar against his shoulder. At the compound, he would clean his weapon, review the day's events, and prepare for the next mission. Each day was a cycle of observation, protection, and anticipation, a rhythm he had perfected over years of solitude and vigilance. Even as the empire grew and its influence spread beyond the familiar hills, the sniper remained a constant, unseen yet indispensable. He was the invisible hand guiding events from the shadows, the quiet force ensuring that the men who led the cartel could operate with confidence. His presence was felt in the safety of convoys, the failure of rival attacks, and the uninterrupted flow of operations. He had become more than a man, he was a symbol of precision, patience, and silent authority. As evening fell and the desert cooled, he would climb to a ridge to watch the stars. The wind brushed against his skin, carrying the sense of dust and distant fires. The world below moved unaware of his presence, yet he remained vigilant, perched between light and shadow, a guardian whose existence was measured not in recognition but in results. The Sinaloa Sniper had become eternal in the stillness, a force that shaped the empire without stepping into the light, whose story would live quietly in the folds of the desert long after he was gone. And in the quiet of the night, beneath a sky vast and endless, he allowed himself the smallest acknowledgement: he was no longer the boy who had hunted in the hills. He was a master of observation, a protector, a shadow whose life and actions held the delicate balance of an empire in his hands, silent, precise, and unyielding in the stillness of the Sinaloa desert. The early morning mist clung to the jagged ridges of Sinaloa, softening the harsh outlines of the hills and casting a dreamlike haze over the desert below. From his hidden perch, the sniper watched the convoy slowly winding its way along the narrow canyon roads, the vehicles like miniature insects against the vast expanse of rock and scrub. Every detail mattered: a flicker of movement behind a boulder, the uneven spacing of the trucks, the glint of metal in the sunlight. Years of experience had trained him to notice the smallest anomaly, to read the landscape as if it were a living map of threats and opportunity. The sniper had become more than an observer. He was a master of patience, precision, and foresight. Every mission, every ridge, every moment of stillness reinforced his role as the silent protector of the cartel's most critical operations. Men whispered his name in hushed tones, El Ángel, yet few had ever glimpsed the man behind the rifle. He did not seek recognition or praise. The desert and the rifle were his only companions, the only constants in a world of shifting alliances, rivalries, and danger. On this particular morning, a subtle unease threaded through the hills. Something in the air, the way the dust hung, the way a distant shadow moved, suggested that the day would not pass without incident. He adjusted the scope of his rifle and scanned the distant ridges, noting movement that was almost imperceptible, a figure moving too deliberately, the flicker of a hand near a weapon, the slight shimmer of light off a metallic object. The sniper's senses had become so finely tuned that he could detect the slightest irregularity, and he knew that even the smallest detail could foreshadow disaster. The convoy crept along the canyon road, the men inside unaware of the threat that had already begun to take shape. He studied the rival scout who emerged from the shadows of a ridge, noting posture, weight distribution, and direction of gaze. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger, his breathing slow and controlled. Timing was everything. One well-placed shot would neutralize the threat without alerting anyone below. He had learned long ago that patience, rather than speed, was often the key to survival. Minutes stretched, the world around him silent except for the whisper of wind through the rocks. The scout moved closer to the convoy's path, testing the vigilance of the men below. The sniper's mind mapped each possible outcome, calculated distances, wind, and elevation, and considered the behaviors of both enemy and ally. Then, with perfect timing, he fired. The bullet struck true. The threat was eliminated before it could impact the convoy, and the vehicles continued without incident. The desert absorbed the sound of the shot, leaving only the faint scent of spent gunpowder and the soft echo of the event lingering in the hills. Afterward, he descended from his vantage point, moving with deliberate caution. Each step was precise, each movement calculated to avoid detection. At the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical care, the process almost meditative. Around him, men whispered about the morning's events, awe and fear mingling in their voices. "It's like he knows before we do," one lieutenant murmured. But the sniper offered no response. Words were unnecessary, his work spoke for itself. Even in moments of quiet, the weight of his actions pressed on him. He had become the invisible force maintaining the fragile balance of an empire. Each shot fired, each decision made, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long, often spent alone under a sky thick with stars, the wind carrying the scents of dust, smoke, and distant fires. Memories of past ambushes, of lives lost or spared, floated unbidden, a constant reminder of the stakes inherent in his work. Despite the growing complexity and reach of the cartel, the sniper remained indispensable. Operations stretched into foreign territories, alliances were tested, and rival factions constantly adapted. He had become not just a marksman, but a strategist in his own right, anticipating threats, reading patterns, and responding with exacting precision. Every mission reinforced the delicate web of power that the cartel relied upon, and he operated at the center of it all, unseen yet undeniably critical. He often reflected on the boy he had once been, hunting rabbits to feed his family. That boy had learned patience and observation but had never imagined the magnitude of responsibility that awaited him. Now, every ridge he occupied, every bullet fired, every hour spent in silence and observation carried the weight of countless lives. The sniper had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and the quiet mastery of his craft. As evening approached, the sniper climbed to a higher vantage point to watch the fading convoy. The light shifted across the ridges, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the desert floor. He felt a familiar sense of both power and isolation. The empire below relied on his presence, yet he remained a ghost, unseen and unacknowledged. He had become both protector and enforcer, a figure whose existence was measured not by recognition, but by the uninterrupted survival of those he guarded. In the stillness of twilight, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The desert had shaped him, honed him, and defined his purpose. He understood the paradox of his life: he was indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet solitary. His mastery over his environment, his rifle, and his mind ensured that the empire would endure another day, but the cost of that vigilance was perpetual isolation. And as night settled over the hills, stars scattered across the sky like shards of glass, he adjusted his scope one last time. The world below moved on, oblivious to the shadow that watched over it. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, silent, precise, eternal, a guardian perched between light and darkness, his story etched not in words but in the unseen balance of power he maintained, shaping the fate of an empire with each quiet, measured breath. The late afternoon sun poured over the jagged ridges of Sinaloa, turning the desert into a mosaic of gold and rust, the shadows stretching long across the valleys. The sniper lay hidden among the sparse scrub, rifle steady, eyes scanning the winding dirt roads below. Convoys moved like slow, deliberate rivers through the canyon, unaware of the invisible guardian perched above. Years of practice had taught him to see every detail, the subtle shimmer of dust on the road, the uneven spacing of trucks, a glint of metal where it should not be. Every small anomaly could signal danger, and every moment demanded total focus. The sniper had evolved from a boy who had once hunted rabbits for food into a man whose skill dictated life and death for an entire empire. The Sinaloa cartel depended on him, not for leadership, not for charisma, but for his unwavering precision, his patience, and his ability to predict the unpredictable. Men spoke his name quietly, almost reverently, El Ángel, the angel who protected them from threats they could not see. Yet he remained unseen, a shadow in the desert, moving only with necessity and purpose. On this particular afternoon, a ripple of tension threaded through the canyon. He noticed a figure perched on a distant ridge, moving cautiously, testing the landscape with deliberate steps. His instincts told him something was different. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to him it was a warning. The sniper adjusted his scope, his breath slowing, his body perfectly still. Timing, he knew, was everything. One shot, precisely placed, could neutralize the threat without alarming the convoy below. He watched the scout's movements, noting the shift in weight, the angle of the head, the nervous glances toward the road. Patience had become a skill honed to the point of instinct, and he allowed it to guide him. Every muscle relaxed, every sense alert. The scout crept closer, unaware that his life would be decided in the next heartbeat. Then, with the calm efficiency that defined him, the sniper fired. The threat fell silently, neutralized before the convoy even registered danger. The vehicles continued, unaffected, while the desert absorbed the sound of gunfire and the faint scent of spent powder. Descending from his perch, he moved with the deliberate care of a predator navigating the terrain. Each step was calculated, avoiding loose stones and dry brush that might give away his position. At the compound, he cleaned his rifle with a methodical attention to detail that was almost ritualistic. Men whispered about the morning's events, awe and fear mingling in their tones. "He sees before we even know," a lieutenant murmured. He offered no response. Words were unnecessary, his work had already spoken volumes. Despite the growing complexity of the cartel's operations, the sniper's role remained critical. Shipments crossed borders, alliances were negotiated and tested, and rival factions probed weaknesses constantly. He had become more than a marksman, he was a strategist, predicting patterns, analyzing behavior, and striking before danger could materialize. Each mission reinforced the delicate balance upon which the cartel relied, and his presence was the linchpin holding that balance together. Yet with his power came the weight of responsibility. Every shot fired, every threat neutralized, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long and solitary, spent perched in the hills beneath skies thick with stars. The desert whispered around him, and memories of past ambushes, of lives saved and lives lost, drifted unbidden into his consciousness. These reflections were not regrets but reminders of the delicate line he walked, where precision and timing dictated survival. The sniper often thought of the boy he had once been, hunting in the hills to feed his family, unaware that patience and observation would one day be the difference between life and death. That boy had learned the basics of tracking and patience, but had no inkling of the scale of responsibility that awaited him. Now, each ridge he occupied, every moment spent observing, and every bullet fired carried immense weight. He had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and unwavering focus, molded by necessity and experience. As the day waned, he climbed to a higher vantage point to watch the convoy disappear into the distance. The light shifted across the mountains, painting long shadows that stretched like fingers over the terrain. A familiar feeling of both power and isolation settled over him. The empire relied on his unseen presence, yet he remained a ghost, unacknowledged, indispensable yet alone. He had become both protector and enforcer, a figure whose life was measured not in recognition but in the uninterrupted survival of those he served. In the quiet of twilight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The desert had shaped him, honed him, and defined his purpose. He understood the paradox of his existence, invisible yet vital, solitary yet critical. His mastery over observation, terrain, and rifle had become the silent backbone of an empire that might never know his name. And as darkness settled over the hills, the stars emerging in scattered brilliance across the sky, he adjusted his scope one final time. Below, the world moved on, oblivious to the shadow that watched it. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, precise, patient, and eternal, a guardian perched between light and shadow, shaping the fate of an empire without recognition, crafting his legacy in silence, and ensuring survival with every measured breath in the stillness of the desert. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, a vast expanse of jagged ridges, dry riverbeds, and scattered scrub that seemed almost eternal in its stillness. From his perch on a rocky outcrop, the sniper observed the convoy making its careful way through the narrow canyon roads below. Years of experience had taught him to read the land like a living map, to anticipate every movement, every potential threat, and every irregularity that could signal danger. The trucks moved slowly, the drivers meticulous in their attention, yet they were unaware of the silent guardian perched high above, whose focus and patience dictated the safety of the entire operation. He had become more than a marksman, he was a sentinel, an unseen force whose skill ensured the survival of the cartel's most important men. Each mission, each ridge, each long hour of vigilance had refined him into a figure almost mythic in precision. Men spoke his name quietly, El Angel, a whisper of reverence for the man whose presence alone deterred threats and maintained the fragile balance of power. He neither sought acknowledgement nor fame, his satisfaction lay in the quiet success of each operation, the preservation of lives, and the meticulous execution of his craft. This morning, a subtle tension threaded through the hills. A flicker of movement on a distant ridge caught his attention, a shadow out of place, the glint of metal that did not belong. Instincts sharpened, he adjusted his scope, the cool metal pressing against his cheek, and studied the figure moving cautiously toward the convoy's route. A scout, no doubt, sent by a rival faction to test their defenses. Patience had long become his greatest weapon. He waited, breathing slowly, aligning his mind and body with the rhythm of the desert. Every movement of the scout was analyzed with painstaking detail, posture, weight distribution, the angle of the head, the subtle glance toward the road below. The sniper's finger rested lightly on the trigger, ready, but unwilling to act prematurely. Timing, he knew, was everything. A single miscalculation could jeopardize the convoy or reveal his position. He had learned that control, patience, and precision often outweighed haste. Minutes stretched like hours as he waited, the desert air thick with anticipation. Then, at the perfect moment, he fired. The bullet struck true, eliminating the threat before the convoy even registered the danger. The trucks continued on their path, unaware of the near catastrophe averted, while the desert absorbed the sound of the shot, leaving only the faint scent of gunpowder and the echo of inevitability lingering in the canyons. Descending from his vantage point, the sniper moved with deliberate care, every step calculated to avoid detection. Back at the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, a ritual that grounded him after the tension of the mission. Men whispered quietly about the morning's events, awe and fear mingling in their voices. "It's as if he sees before we even know," one lieutenant murmured. The sniper did not respond. Words were unnecessary, his actions spoke volumes, and the desert had already witnessed the outcome. His role extended beyond merely neutralizing threats. The Sinaloa cartel's operations had grown increasingly complex, spanning towns, regions, and even international borders. Rivals tested their power at every opportunity, law enforcement probed their networks, and even within the cartel, loyalty was sometimes fragile. He had evolved into a strategist as well as a marksman, anticipating patterns, reading behaviors, and acting before threats could fully emerge. Every mission reinforced the delicate web upon which the cartel's survival depended, and he operated at the center of that balance, unseen yet indispensable. Even with mastery over his craft, he could not escape the weight of responsibility. Each decision, each shot, carried consequences that could ripple across the empire. Nights were long and solitary, spent perched under skies thick with stars, the wind whispering across the ridges. Memories of past ambushes, of lives saved and lives lost, surfaced in quiet moments, reminders of the stakes inherent in his work. These reflections were not regrets, but acknowledgments of the fragile line between success and catastrophe. The sniper often allowed himself to think of the boy he had once been, hunting rabbits in the hills to feed his family. That boy had learned patience and observation, but he had not yet understood the magnitude of responsibility that awaited him. Now, every ridge he occupied, every hour of vigilance, every bullet fired carried the weight of countless lives. He had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and the silent mastery of his craft. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, the sniper climbed to a higher vantage point to watch the convoy fade into the distance. The shifting light revealed the contours of the landscape, highlighting the stark beauty of the desert and the precariousness of life within it. He felt the familiar paradox of his existence, indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet utterly alone. The empire relied on his vigilance, yet he remained a ghost, a figure whose life was measured not by recognition, but by the uninterrupted survival of those he protected. In the quiet twilight, he allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The desert had shaped him, honed him, and defined his purpose. He understood the paradox of his life, invisible yet vital, solitary yet central. His mastery over observation, terrain, and rifle had become the silent backbone of an empire that might never know his name. Each mission, each shot, each hour of patient stillness had become part of a rhythm that preserved lives and shaped the destiny of men who could never repay the cost of his solitude. As darkness settled over the hills, stars glittering across the vast sky, he adjusted his scope one final time. Below, the world moved on, oblivious to the silent guardian perched above. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, patient, precise, eternal, a sentinel between light and shadow, guiding the fate of an empire with quiet, measured determination, leaving his story etched not in words, but in the unseen protection he provided, shaping history from the shadows of the desert. The early morning light crept slowly over the jagged hills of Sinaloa, softening the harsh angles of rock and casting long, golden shadows across the desert floor. From his concealed perch on a ridge, the sniper observed the convoy winding its way through the narrow canyon below. Years of training and countless missions had honed his senses to a fine edge. Every detail mattered, the flicker of dust, the subtle shimmer of sunlight on metal, the smallest irregularity in the spacing of trucks or the movements of the men inside. Each anomaly was a potential signal of danger, and his mind catalogued every one, calculating risk and anticipating consequence with unerring precision. He had become more than a marksman, he was a sentinel, a ghostly presence whose vigilance ensured the survival of the cartel's most important figures. Each mission, each ridge, each long hour of stillness had sharpened him into a figure almost mythic in his precision. Men whispered his name in reverent tones, El Ángel, the angel who protected the empire from threats invisible to all but him. He never sought recognition, there was no need. His satisfaction came from the flawless execution of his duties, from knowing that lives were preserved. And operations continued without disruption. This morning, a subtle tension rippled through the canyon. From the far ridge, a figure moved cautiously, testing the terrain, eyes flicking toward the road below. The sniper adjusted his scope, inhaling and exhaling slowly to steady his heartbeat. Instinct had become a second nature, honed by countless hours of observation and discipline. He understood that a single miscalculation could jeopardize not only the convoy but also the secrecy of his own position. Timing, patience, and precision were everything. As the scout approached a vantage point overlooking the convoy, the sniper's mind calculated trajectory, distance, wind, and movement. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with anticipation. Then, with the calm efficiency that had defined him for years, he fired. The threat was neutralized instantly, a silent casualty in the balance between life and death. The convoy passed through the canyon unharmed, oblivious to the danger that had been averted by the unseen hand perched high above. Descending from his perch, he moved with deliberate care, his steps calculated to avoid detection. At the compound, he methodically cleaned his rifle, the repetitive task providing a measure of calm after the tense events of the morning. Men whispered quietly about the sniper's efficiency, all mingling with fear. "It's like he anticipates every move before it happens," one lieutenant murmured. The sniper said nothing. His work spoke for him. Each mission, each ridge, each patient moment of observation, reinforced the delicate balance of power he maintained silently. Despite his mastery, the weight of responsibility was ever present. Every shot fired, every life saved or ended, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long, often spent alone under the vast expanse of stars, the wind whispering across the ridges. Memories of past ambushes, of lives taken and lives preserved, surfaced unbidden, reminding him that survival was never guaranteed, that control was always fragile. The sniper often reflected on the boy he had once been, hunting rabbits in the hills to feed his family. That boy had learned patience and observation, but had not yet grasped the magnitude of responsibility that awaited him. Now, every ridge he occupied, every hour spent in stillness, every shot fired carried the weight of countless lives. He had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and the quiet mastery of his craft, shaped by the desert and the inevitability of consequence. As the day wore on, the sun shifted, casting deep shadows across the canyon floor. The convoy had long disappeared from view, yet the sniper remained vigilant. The world around him moved in patterns that only he could read, rhythms of movement that dictated where danger might emerge. Rivals were constantly probing, law enforcement sought weaknesses, and alliances within the cartel could shift unexpectedly. Every day demanded the same unwavering focus, the same silent calculation, and the same readiness to act with lethal precision. Even in moments of apparent calm, he understood the precariousness of his position. He was indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet solitary. The empire depended on his unseen hand, yet he remained a shadow among the ridges, unacknowledged and often forgotten. That duality defined him, a man whose life was measured not in recognition but in the uninterrupted survival of those he protected. As twilight approached, he climbed to a higher vantage point to watch the fading horizon, the colors of the sky shifting from gold to deep indigo. The desert whispered around him, carrying the faint sense of dust, sage, and distant fires. He allowed himself a brief reflection, acknowledging the paradox of his existence. He had become a master of patience, observation, and lethal efficiency, yet the cost was solitude and a life lived in the quiet shadow of others' achievements. Night fell over the hills, stars emerging one by one in the vast, unbroken sky. The sniper adjusted his scope, ready for the next convoy, the next threat, the next challenge. Below him, the empire continued to function, its leaders moving with confidence that rested on the foundation of his vigilance. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, precise, patient, eternal, a silent guardian perched between light and darkness, shaping events without recognition, guiding the fate of an empire with unwavering focus, and crafting a legacy in quiet mastery that few would ever understand but all would ultimately rely upon. The first rays of dawn stretched slowly over the jagged hills of Sinaloa, turning the rocky ridges into long, soft silhouettes against the pale sky. The sniper lay motionless on a high outcrop, his rifle resting lightly in his hands, eyes scanning the winding canyon roads below. Months and years of experience had taught him to read the land like an open book, every detail carrying meaning, the shimmer of dust, the subtle shift of a branch, the glint of metal in the sun. Each anomaly was a signal, each shadow a potential threat. The sniper had become a master of patience, observation, and silent precision, his very presence dictating life and death for those who traveled beneath him. He was no longer merely a marksman, he had become an invisible sentinel, a force whose skill ensured the survival of the cartel's most valuable men. Each ridge he occupied, each long hour of stillness, had shaped him into a figure whispered about with reverence, El Ángel. Few had ever seen him, yet his reputation traveled ahead of him, carried on the hushed tones of those who knew his importance. He never sought recognition, for his satisfaction was not in praise but in the quiet execution of his craft, each successful mission a testament to discipline, patience, and control. That morning, the sniper sensed an unusual tension in the hills. Something was different. His keen eyes caught movement on a distant ridge, subtle, deliberate, calculated. A scout, sent by a rival faction to assess the convoy, crept along the rocks, unaware that his every step had already been anticipated. The sniper adjusted his scope, aligned his breathing, and waited. He had learned that patience was often more lethal than speed, that the smallest hesitation could make all the difference. The scout moved closer, the angle of his head revealing his focus on the convoy below. The sniper's mind mapped trajectories, calculated wind, distance, and elevation, while his muscles remained still, coiled, ready. He had spent years learning to merge with the landscape, to become part of the desert itself, and now he acted with the precision of a man who had studied every ridge, every rock, every possible approach. When the moment was perfect, he fired. The bullet struck with deadly accuracy, neutralizing the threat without alerting anyone in the convoy. The trucks moved on, unscathed, while the desert swallowed the sound of the shot and the faint smell of spent powder. Descending from his perch, the sniper moved with deliberate caution, every step measured to avoid detection. At the compound, he cleaned his rifle meticulously, a ritual that grounded him after each mission. Around him, whispers circulated among the men, tales of his uncanny foresight and deadly accuracy. "It's like he knows before it happens," a lieutenant muttered, awe mixed with fear. The sniper remained silent. Words were unnecessary, his work was proof enough of his indispensability. The sniper's role extended far beyond eliminating immediate threats. The cartel's operations were sprawling, complex, and constantly evolving. Rivals tested boundaries, law enforcement monitored movements, and internal alliances were often fragile. He had become both observer and strategist, predicting enemy actions, anticipating attacks, and neutralizing dangers before they could materialize. Every mission reinforced the delicate structure upon which the empire depended, and he operated at the center of that structure, unseen yet vital. Even with his mastery, the burden of responsibility was immense. Every shot carried consequences, and every decision had the potential to alter lives permanently. Nights were long and solitary, spent beneath stars that stretched endlessly across the sky. Memories of previous missions, lives saved or lost, drifted through his thoughts, reminders of the fragile balance he maintained. He had learned that survival demanded not only skill but also discipline, patience, and the ability to remain emotionally detached from the chaos around him. The sniper often reflected on the boy he had once been, hunting in the hills to feed his family. That boy had learned patience and awareness, but had not yet grasped the enormity of the responsibilities he would inherit. Now, each ridge he occupied, each long hour of observation, each bullet fired carried immense weight. He had become a man defined by solitude, discipline, and mastery over both himself and the environment, shaped by necessity and honed by experience. As the sun climbed higher, casting shifting shadows across the canyon floor, the sniper remained vigilant. Even after the convoy had passed, he continued to scan the horizon. The landscape moved in patterns only he could interpret, rhythms that dictated the presence of threat and the timing of intervention. Rivals and law enforcement alike were probing constantly, alliances within the cartel were fragile, and any lapse in attention could prove catastrophic. Each day demanded total focus, each moment required absolute stillness. In the quiet of the afternoon, he paused to observe the sweeping desert around him, the sun glinting off the ridges, the wind stirring dust across dry riverbeds. The paradox of his life was clear, indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet solitary. The empire relied on him, yet he remained a shadow among the rocks, unseen and unacknowledged. This duality defined his existence, a man whose life was measured not by fame or recognition, but by the uninterrupted survival of those he protected. As twilight approached, he climbed to a higher vantage point, watching the desert's colors shift from gold to deep indigo. The wind whispered across the ridges, carrying the faint scent of dust, sage, and distant fires. He allowed himself a quiet reflection on the paradox of his existence. Mastery and vigilance demanded solitude, and the Empire's survival depended entirely on his silent presence. As night descended and stars emerged like scattered diamonds across the sky, the sniper adjusted his scope one final time. Below him, the world continued, unaware of the invisible guardian perched high above. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, patient, precise, eternal, a sentinel between light and shadow, guiding the fate of the Empire with quiet, unyielding discipline, and leaving a legacy written not in words but in the invisible protection he provided, shaping history from the shadows of the desert. The early morning haze hung low over the jagged ridges of Sinaloa, the desert bathed in pale gold and soft lavender as the sun slowly crept above the horizon. From his hidden vantage point, the sniper observed the convoy winding its way through the narrow canyon below. Years of practice had sharpened his senses to a point where every subtle detail could speak volumes: the dust kicked up by a tire, the flicker of sunlight off a metallic surface, the barely perceptible sway of a branch. To anyone else, these would have been insignificant, but to him, they were messages, warnings and opportunities waiting to be interpreted. He had become more than a marksman, he had become the unseen heartbeat of the cartel, the quiet force whose vigilance dictated the survival of men who had never met him. Every ridge he occupied, every hour of stillness, every patient observation had molded him into a figure of silent legend, El Ángel. Men whispered his name with reverence, aware that his presence alone deterred threats. He neither sought acknowledgement nor fame, his reward lay in the seamless execution of his duties, in lives preserved, and in the knowledge that the Empire could function because of him. That morning, there was a subtle tension in the air that set him on high alert. On a distant ridge, a figure emerged, moving cautiously and scanning the convoy below. The sniper's instincts immediately recognized the threat. He adjusted his scope, aligning his breathing with the rhythm of the desert, as he had countless times before. Patience had become his most lethal weapon. He knew that premature action could compromise the mission or reveal his position. Precision demanded stillness, and he waited, coiled like a spring. The scout moved with careful deliberation, eyes scanning, body tense. Every shift, every gesture, was analyzed in real time. The sniper calculated trajectory, wind, elevation, and movement, while his muscles remained perfectly still, almost merging with the rocks around him. The desert had become an extension of his senses, every ridge, every shadow, every contour of the landscape ingrained in his memory. When the moment was perfect, he fired. The threat fell silently, neutralized before the convoy even knew it existed. The trucks continued their path unscathed, while the desert swallowed the sound of gunfire, leaving only a faint echo of inevitability. Descending from his perch, the sniper moved with deliberate, calculated steps, careful to avoid loose stones or dry brush that might betray his presence. At the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, a ritual that grounded him after each tense mission. Around him, men whispered in awe and fear of the morning's events. "It's like he sees before it happens," one lieutenant murmured. The sniper did not respond. His work spoke for itself, every mission a silent testament to his skill and discipline. Even as the cartel's influence expanded and operations grew increasingly complex, the sniper's role remained critical. Rival factions tested borders, law enforcement probed weaknesses, and internal loyalties shifted constantly. He had become both observer and strategist, anticipating danger before it materialized and neutralizing it with surgical precision. Each mission reinforced the delicate balance upon which the cartel relied, and he was at the center of that balance, unseen yet indispensable. Yet mastery came with the weight of responsibility. Every shot carried consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long and solitary, spent beneath a sky thick with stars. The wind whispered through the ridges, carrying dust, sage, and distant smoke. Memories of past missions, lives lost, and narrowly averted tragedies surfaced unbidden, reminders of the fragile line between control and chaos. He had learned that survival depended not only on skill, but on discipline, emotional detachment, and unwavering patience. The sniper often reflected on the boy he had once been, hunting small game to feed his family. That boy had learned patience, awareness, and the art of observation, but he could never have anticipated the responsibility that would define him. Now, each ridge he occupied, each hour of stillness, each carefully measured shot carried immense weight. He had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and mastery of both himself and the environment, shaped by the harsh lessons of the desert. As the sun climbed, the shadows shifted across the canyon floor. Even after the convoy had passed, he continued to scan the horizon. The landscape moved in patterns only he could interpret, rhythms that dictated where threats might emerge and when intervention was required. Rivals tested boundaries, law enforcement investigated, and internal power struggles were constant. Each day demanded total focus, absolute stillness, and the readiness to act with lethal precision at a moment's notice. Even in quiet moments, he understood the paradox of his life, indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet solitary. The empire depended on his vigilance, yet he remained a ghost among the ridges, unacknowledged and unseen. That duality defined him, a man whose existence was measured not by fame or recognition, but by the uninterrupted survival of those under his silent protection. As twilight approached, he climbed to a higher vantage point, watching the desert colors shift from gold to deep indigo. The wind whispered across the ridges, carrying the faint sense of dust, sage, and distant fires. He allowed himself a brief reflection on the paradox of his existence. Mastery demanded solitude, yet the empire's survival depended entirely on his silent presence. When night finally fell, stars glittered across the vast sky, the world below moving on unaware of the silent guardian above. The sniper adjusted his scope one final time, ready for any threat that might emerge. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, patient, precise, eternal, a sentinel between light and shadow, shaping the fate of the empire with quiet determination, and leaving a legacy written not in words, but in the invisible protection he provided from the hills of the desert. The desert of Sinaloa stretched endlessly beneath the rising sun, jagged ridges and dry riverbeds catching the light in a way that transformed the harsh terrain into a canvas of gold, rust, and shadow. From his concealed perch, the sniper observed the convoy winding carefully through the canyon below, every vehicle, every movement catalogued in his mind with painstaking precision. Years of experience had honed his senses into an almost supernatural awareness. The faint flicker of dust, the subtle reflection of sunlight off metal, the barely perceptible sway of a branch, all were potential signs of danger. In the stillness of the hills, he read these signs like a language of survival. He had become more than a marksman, he was the unseen guardian whose skill ensured the continuity of the cartel's operations and the safety of its most important men. Each ridge he occupied, each hour spent in quiet observation, each long period of stillness had molded him into a figure of quiet legend, El Ángel. Few had ever glimpsed him, yet his presence was known and feared. Recognition meant little, he sought neither glory nor praise. The satisfaction of his work came from the seamless execution of each mission, the preservation of lives, and the certainty that the empire could function because of him. That morning, an unusual tension threaded the hills. A shadow moved on a distant ridge, deliberate, calculated, testing the terrain. The sniper adjusted his scope, controlled his breathing, and prepared for what he knew was inevitable. Instinct and experience merged in perfect harmony. He understood that even the smallest hesitation could compromise not only the convoy but also his own position. Patience and precision had become his most formidable weapons, honed through years of training, observation, and silent vigilance. The scout on the ridge moved cautiously, eyes darting toward the convoy, body tense and calculated. The sniper analyzed every movement, every shift, every nuance of posture. Trajectory, wind, distance, and elevation all converged in his mind, while his muscles remained perfectly still, almost blending with the rocks around him. The desert was no longer simply a backdrop, it had become a part of him, every ridge and shadow memorized, every detail of the landscape ingrained in his awareness. When the moment arrived, he fired. The threat fell silently, neutralized before the convoy even perceived danger. The trucks continued along the canyon road, unscathed, while the desert absorbed the shot, leaving only a faint smell of gunpowder and the subtle echo of inevitability. Descending from his perch, he moved with meticulous care, avoiding loose stones or dry brush that could betray his position. At the compound, he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, the ritual grounding him after the tension of the morning. Around him, men whispered in awe and fear of his efficiency. "He knows before it even happens," one lieutenant murmured. The sniper did not respond. His work spoke for itself. Each mission, each ridge, each quiet hour of observation reinforced the delicate balance he maintained, the unseen foundation upon which the empire relied. Even as the cartel's influence grew and operations became increasingly complex, his role remained central. Rival factions probed borders, law enforcement tested vulnerabilities, and internal loyalties shifted constantly. He had become both observer and strategist, predicting enemy actions and neutralizing threats before they could fully materialize. Each operation reinforced the fragile structure upon which the cartel's survival depended, and he existed at the center of that structure, unseen yet indispensable. The weight of responsibility was constant. Each decision, each shot, carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long and solitary, spent under skies thick with stars, the wind whispering across the ridges. Memories of previous ambushes, lives saved and lost, surfaced in quiet moments, reminders of the precarious balance he maintained. Survival demanded skill, discipline, emotional detachment, and unwavering focus. He often reflected on the boy he had once been, hunting in the hills to feed his family. That boy had learned patience, awareness, and careful observation but had not foreseen the responsibilities that would shape his life. Now, each ridge he occupied, every hour of observation, and every shot fired carried immense weight. He had become a man defined by discipline, solitude, and mastery of both himself and his environment, forged in the harsh realities of the desert. As the sun climbed higher, casting shifting shadows across the canyon floor, he remained vigilant. Even after the convoy had passed, he scanned the horizon, reading patterns in the terrain that only he could interpret. Rival factions and law enforcement tested boundaries, alliances were fragile, and any lapse could be fatal. Each day demanded total focus, absolute stillness, and readiness to act at a moment's notice. Even in apparent calm, he understood the paradox of his life, indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet solitary. The empire relied on his vigilance, yet he remained a ghost among the ridges, unacknowledged and unseen. That duality defined him, a man whose existence was measured not by fame or recognition, but by the uninterrupted survival of those under his silent protection. As twilight approached, he climbed to a higher vantage point, watching the desert colors shift from gold to deep indigo. The wind whispered across the ridges, carrying the faint sense of dust, sage, and distant fires. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, acknowledging the paradox of his existence. Mastery demanded solitude, yet the empire's survival depended entirely on his silent presence. As night descended and stars spread across the vast sky, he adjusted his scope one final time. Below, the world moved on, unaware of the silent guardian above. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, patient, precise, eternal, a sentinel between light and shadow, shaping the fate of the empire with quiet determination, leaving a legacy written not in words, but in the invisible protection he provided, shaping history from the shadows of the desert. The night had settled over the jagged hills of Sinaloa, the desert bathed in pale moonlight. From his high perch, the sniper observed the convoy winding through the canyon below. Every movement, every flicker of dust, every glint of metal was catalogued with unerring precision. Years of practice had honed him into a master of patience, observation, and timing. He had become more than a marksman, he was the unseen backbone of the cartel, the silent guardian ensuring the survival of those below. El Ángel, whispered in reverent tones, struck before threats could materialize. Recognition mattered little, his satisfaction came from the seamless execution of his duties and the preservation of lives. That night, the air held calm tension. A shadow moved on a distant ridge, but he detected it immediately. Breathing slow, muscles still, he waited for the perfect moment. Every decision, every shot, carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Nights were long and solitary, memories of past missions reminding him of the fragile balance he maintained. He reflected on the boy he once was, hunting to feed his family, and understood the paradox of his life, indispensable yet invisible, powerful yet alone. As the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, he adjusted his scope one final time. The Sinaloa Sniper remained, a sentinel between light and shadow, precise, patient, eternal.